Talking about things going well and things going badly, you did some research about men's suffering and people's responses to it as well. What was that?
Yeah, so that was the theoretical framework was based on Kurt Gray's work, and he has looked at, in the domain of moral psychology, he's looked at moral typecasting, which is this tendency to, he argues that when we perceive a moral action, we kind of instinctively classify people as either the perpetrator or the victim. So we have this dyadic heuristic when we perceive moral actions. And so we took that framework and we looked at, okay, might there be a gender bias in our tendency to place men and women in the victim and perpetrator categories? And so across a series of studies, what we found was that we more instinctively classify women as victims and men as perpetrators. And so Kurt Gray's model argues that when you classify someone as a perpetrator, it makes it more challenging to see them as a victim, and vice versa. So if you classify someone as a victim, it's harder to see them as a perpetrator. And so these roles are pretty consequential because they're associated with sympathy and blame. And so what we found is that congruent with this typecasting, we found that people more easily blame men than women, and they more easily feel sympathy for women than men.
Is that both men and women feel that?
Yes. We did find in some of our studies, we found that women showed the bias to a stronger degree than did men, but we didn't find that super consistently. And so I think that this makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, because if we think about reproduction, women set the upper limit. So women contribute, they basically bring more to the reproductive table.
They're more valuable.
Exactly. And so if you have a group with very few women, you're not going to have many babies being produced compared to if you have a group with a lot of women. You really only need a couple of men to still produce many babies.
A couple of men having an absolutely fantastic time.
Yeah, I'm sure they would be very delighted until an enemy group comes in, and then they have to...
Having a bad time.
Yeah. So probably wouldn't last long. But exactly. So women are more reproductively valuable. So I think it makes sense that we might have these biases to kind of protect women from harm. But this can be really problematic when we might be less likely to recognize men's suffering. So I think when we think about the distribution of social outcomes, we tend to focus at the top end of the distribution, where we might recognize, like, oh, women are less often CEOs, less often world leaders. This is certainly true. But when you look at the bottom end of the distribution, men are more often homeless, more often imprisoned, more often dropping out of school. They're more likely to die by suicide, die by drug overdose. So men aren't thriving at this side of the societal distribution. And so I think in this case, it can be really problematic that we don't recognize, or less easily recognize, men as victims and have less sympathy for their suffering.
You see this reflected in IQ distribution as well, right? That you have more men at the top and more men at the bottom. And it's kind of the same. The men are just, who is it that said, might have been David Buss that said, men are evolution's playthings. That you roll the dice with them a little bit more. There's more genetic variation. We'll see what happens. They're kind of more disposable because, as you say, it's women that set the upper bound in terms of procreation. So I understand why it would be the case that we're more prepared to see men suffer in one regard, that they're just kind of like less, that they need to be less protected and they need to be less valuable. The interesting question, I suppose, is in a modern world where women don't need to be coddled so much anymore, that we don't have the same physical concerns, and yet we have this mismatch now where the ability to give sympathy to men who perhaps very much need it isn't there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is problematic in a modern environment. And I mean, for multiple reasons. So not only that we can't recognize men's suffering, but also that if we're more inclined to see women in this like patient role, this like suffering victim role, it makes it harder for us to see them as agentic. And so I think this might contribute to why we more easily recognize men as leaders. And so it's not always, unilaterally positive to see women as like the patient.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yes.
Yeah. And so it's like, it can be harmful when you want to, in the voting booth, you're not going to be recognized as an agent and maybe not as a CEO. But in the context of moral harm, you're not going to be blamed to the same degree.
Did you see, speaking about in the voting booth thing, Christina Durante taught me that in a political race between two women, the woman who loses is the one that has better marital outcomes long term. Like her relationship is the one that ends up being better long term.
For her relationship.
Yes, yeah, for her private relationship. I just thought that was so funny. Everything gets folded into this. I remember seeing a tweet from you as well about Steve Stuart Williams' study. Steve Stuart Williams found that people respond more favorably to scientific findings showing women outperform men versus the converse. People wrongly assumed men prefer male-favoring findings may suggest gender biases in reviews/publishing of research. What do you think's going on there?
Yeah, so I think that because we tend to, see women, we want women to have beneficial outcomes. We put them in this like, let's help the victim category. It can make them more appealing and easier to support compared to men. If we view men as perpetrators and agents, it's easier to see what they're doing as malicious. And so if we're kind of encountering information that women have some positive trait, we're like, oh, good, let's help them.
I suppose as well, what would be the social signal that would give you some reflected glory of championing the underdog if you're championing the one that, in terms of a cliche archetype, is already the one that used to do this thing, that used to overperform?
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yeah. So you look more beneficial, or you look more pro-social by championing, women's success, because we assume women are doing worse across the board, which is true at the top end of the distribution, not at the bottom. And so, yeah, I think that's it'd be fun to look at, like, what moral credits do people get for, helping women or promoting these things that help women versus men. We did actually conduct a study. We haven't submitted it yet, but it was a politician talking about men's afflictions in the world, and we didn't say what the politician's gender was. So it was them giving a speech talking about all the ways that men are suffering in the world. And then in the other condition, we just changed men to women. And so in that condition, the statements were no longer true. And because it was about women, and women are actually in those contexts doing better. So they're like, not dropping out of school to the same degree as men are. And so what we found is that people liked the politician talking about the female disadvantages, even though their statements were not true. So they liked that politician more, were more likely to vote for that politician, wanted to donate more, perceived them as more moral, even though the statements weren't true. And so it was interesting because our male participants correctly identified that the statements were less true, but I don't think our female participants did. And so I think there supports some of that bias that I was telling you about, where our female participants tended to show more favoritism towards women across the board, which I think makes sense. If we think about our female ancestors, they needed to recruit female allies. So one way to do that might be to signal, hey, I'm on team women, which probably throughout human history was pretty consequential, because say your, male partner was being really violent towards you, you would want a female ally that was team women, because she might be more likely to recruit social support on your behalf. But if that occurred enough throughout human history that other women preferred the females that had the female bias, then that might contribute to why we see modern women today showing this pro-female bias.
What's happening, people? If you enjoyed that, then press here for the full, unedited episode. And don't forget to subscribe. Peace.